All right, friends, we are still continuing this little series that is leading up to the book of Titus, where we are going to be doing a verse by verse exposition through Titus. And we have come to the point, having looked at Acts chapters 20 through to 25, which leads up to Paul's first arrest, where we were having a look at some examples of Paul in his character, in his faith, which we can learn from. But the main purpose behind it was just to lead up that we could understand the events of Paul and the events in Paul's day that led to the writing of Titus, and of course 1 Timothy as well. So I'm going to wrap up with these prelude type events so that we can start our next video in Titus with the correct context and the background information that is necessary to almost personalize the information in Titus. I don't want to go in depth here because it's not really necessary to get too deep into the events as such, barring the fact that we should know that obviously Paul wrote Titus between his first and second Roman imprisonment as such. And we left off the previous video where Paul was at Caesarea and his journey to Rome would commence after he had stood trial before both Felix and Festus and even King Agrippa at that point. And then King Agrippa famously said, listen, I could have actually set you free, but because you appealed to Caesar you will go. So I'm going to take it up here where Paul is now in Rome and he is under house arrest. And we know from the book of Acts that he was under house arrest for 2 years, and after that 2 years was released from house arrest. And I want to get back to that point shortly. But during his house arrest, he was renting his own home, but obviously under guard from the Roman soldiers and things. So he had limited movement, but he was still able to communicate and receive visitors and even write his epistles, the prison epistles, as we know, during that 2-year period. And Paul was fairly active still in ministry during this time because Jews would come in and inquire from him with regard to his doctrine. He would receive various visitors from the Gentile community. In actual fact, which something I'd like to point out, which we read in Philippians chapter 4, verse 22, is where Paul ends the book of Philippians. And remember that he wrote Philippians during this 2-year house arrest period. In the book of Philippians, right at the end, in his salutations, he writes, "All the saints salute you, chiefly they which are of Caesar's household," which informs us as well, if we read between the lines here, that Paul was having influence in Caesar's household, whether it be the soldiers, whether it be the servants, even whether it be higher up officials or even some of the family members of Caesar at that point of time. The point is that because Paul was continuously speaking the gospel, whoever came into his house, whoever from Caesar's household was in his vicinity while he was teaching the Jews or teaching other Gentiles, heard of these things, possibly inquired of Paul, and then they themselves went back into Caesar's household and into the palace possibly, and then communicated these things with their friends and fellow servants or fellow soldiers and so forth, and the word just spread during this time. Did you hear what Paul said? Did you hear that we have salvation without works? Did you hear this man who was crucified for our sins? And this would have just spread. We know there's an innate power in the gospel. Romans chapter 1, verse 16. So people would have come to Paul and inquired of things. And even Caesar's household was being influenced. And some of them were even being saved as such. And it's these saved ones in Caesar's household which were sending greetings to the Philippians as well. So this is just the dynamics of this man, Paul, and the power of sharing the gospel. We can pick up examples of this as well, just how the gospel itself does the work of spreading itself throughout a community or a household in this regard. During the 2 years that Paul was still a prisoner in Rome, he also wrote Philemon, and he wrote Colossians and Ephesians and Philippians. And these letters were sent out to the various churches in that regard. Paul would receive word from these churches through visitors, and he would write based on questions, based on doctrine, based on issues that were involved in those churches, based on encouragement and edification to simply edify and communicate to these churches again. So these letters went out from Paul, and he was very active in this regard during these 2 years. Now, some of you might ask, why a house arrest? Why was Paul not in prison? Why was he in a rented house? And why could he receive visitors and be so active in this regard? I want to remind you, based on what we've previously recorded in this little series, is that Paul was never officially put on trial. He was never officially convicted of any particular breaking of the law. Even that Claudius Lysias could not find anything wrong. He took Paul before the Jewish leaders. Paul spoke about the resurrection, which divided that Jewish get together, and there was no official conviction of Paul. And this Roman commander Claudius Lysias, which we spoke about in the last video, had to pull Paul out of that meeting because they were going to pull him apart, as Acts says, as Luke writes in Acts. So Paul was sent, because of his appeal to Caesar, he was sent to Rome, and he was now under house arrest. He was waiting during this time for a trial. And because there was no conviction, it was not a high priority case. And Paul just continued his ministry, even in confinement. But because he could write, because he could receive visitors, he was almost as effective as being out there. So this also brings me to the point why Paul was released from this house arrest, because he may have come before Caesar's officials, and because there was no conviction, there was no specific accusations that had come in from the Judaizers or the Jewish leaders, they could not hold him any longer, and thus he was released. And I'll put a map up on the video just to give you a very brief idea of the journey that Paul took after he was released from this 2-year Roman house arrest. He left Rome, he came to Crete, and this is where he left Titus at Crete, and he then continued his journey through to was it Ephesus? Let me just confirm on my notes over here. Yeah, he left Timothy at Ephesus. He wrote 1 Timothy probably from Macedonia as he continued this circle of visiting various churches and encouraging the saints and doing his usual rounds. as such. Um, we also find, and by the way, all of this, all of the information that we have on this between his two Roman imprisonments journey that Paul took to encourage the churches, all comes basically uh, from the pastoral epistles, a little bit from Titus, and most of it from Timothy, the two letters to Timothy, where Paul wrote certain things like he left his cloak and parchments with Carpus, 2 Timothy 4 verse 13, and he needed those parchments. He had arrived in Nicopolis, and he asked for whoever to bring these parchments and his cloak. Um, he mentions also in 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 20 that he left uh, Trophimus ill or sick at Miletus when Paul was there. So there's a few details that help us to understand more or less where Paul journeyed during this particular time. I'm not putting a lot of focus on this. It's not important at this point of time, except to understand that it's during this time that Paul actually wrote 1 Timothy and Titus. And it's Titus in particular, since we're going to be working through a verse by verse of Titus, that you understand that Paul was now released again after a 2-year stint at Rome, and he was now visiting the churches and encouraging the brethren and things during this time. Bear in mind also that Paul knew that a imminent arrest again was on the plate. It's a weird expression that I used there, but Paul could have been arrested at any time again. And of course, we do learn this, that wherever he was during this travel, I understand it possibly have been arrested at Nicopolis where he was wintering, he mentioned, spending time over the winter there. But it could have been anywhere else. The point again is that's not important. But when Paul was arrested again during this time, and it took 5 years, all right, he was in the first Rome imprisonment in AD 60 through to AD 62. And then it's around about AD 67 or 68 that Paul gets arrested again and then taken back to Rome, but this time under much harsher conditions. I believe that Alexander, the coppersmith, also had a role to play in his rearrest because of the issues that he gave. And again, I'm not going to go into details. I've got notes here which I'm not even going to go through because really this is not the focus at this point of time. But the bottom line is Paul, when he was arrested again, was taken back to Rome, but he was put into the Mamertine prison, which was under much harsher conditions. He was not in a rented house anymore. He probably had a trial, and he was declared guilty, and he was cast into this Mamertine dungeons, where his death, his martyrdom was imminent. And it's also during this time, in those harsh conditions and in this prison, where he managed to pen out the second letter to Timothy, which obviously we can read from, and even Paul mentions there that his death is imminent as such. So it's the 5 years between these two imprisonments where Paul was again free and revisiting some churches as such, where 1 Timothy and Titus were penned. And that's all that I want to say about this. There's really no need to go much more in depth into that particular detail. So what I'd like to do is to deal with just a very few pieces of details with regard to the historical context of Paul and his letter to Titus, having looked just briefly at some context on the island of Crete and the culture there. Again, high level. I'm not going to go in depth into this. This is just some pieces of information that you guys can use in order to understand the scenario and the times and the details around the information within the book of Titus. Some challenges that Titus had with the churches at Crete. Who was Titus, and what Paul's purpose was for writing it. So let's just keep this really short, and I'm just going to run through some notes here that I have with regard to this historical context of information. Starting off with the fact that Titus was written roughly about 65 AD, between, as we've discussed, Paul's two imprisonments. And we could find a hint of urgency in this letter, 1 Timothy and Titus as well, and particularly in 2 Timothy, because Paul knew that he was living on borrowed time and another arrest was on the cards. With regard to Crete, where Paul left Titus, because when Paul left Rome after his release, one of the first locations that he stopped at was Crete, and Titus was with him at this point, and this is why he left Titus at Crete when he continued his journey. And then he did the same with Timothy in Ephesus, telling Timothy to stay in Ephesus and continue his work there in the church. But with regard to Crete, it's an island in the Mediterranean, as you could see on the map, and it was infamous for moral depravity, for dishonesty, for greed and violence. Ancient writers described the Cretans as liars, evil beasts, and slow bellies. All right, now that was a prophet, which Paul refers to in Titus chapter 1, verse 12. And what evil beasts means is referring to these Cretans as wild or savage or having immoral behavior. And then slow bellies was a wording or a phrase in that time, which basically meant to be lazy and gluttonous as such, implying self-indulgences and so forth. So this was the makeup of the cities and the people on Crete, as defined by Paul referring to or quoting from this prophet. There was pagan beliefs, particularly the worship of Zeus. And Cretan mythology portrayed Zeus as deceitful, which influenced the cultural norms in that regard. Now, again, this is just historical facts that I've pulled from various sources. So it's just to lay foundation here, to lay your understanding of what Titus's job is going to be like when he's left there in Crete and Paul tells him to establish some churches and things and establish leadership in these churches. This was the feel, the belief system, the immoral, gluttonous, lazy setup that we had here at Crete. Remember, these are Gentiles, right? There's no laws here and things like that, as we know in the Jewish communities. There was also a Jewish population in Crete, which added complexity as Jewish myths and legalism posed challenges to the Christian community at Crete. There was always this constant, going back under the law and this and this and this, which Titus probably had to fight through as well, because Paul said to teach sound doctrine. All right, and we will see this prevalently when we get into Titus, verse by verse. All right, and the purpose for Paul leaving Titus there was to set in order the things that are wanting and ordain elders in every city. Titus 1, verses 5. So the challenges that Titus would have had here was particularly with false teachings. The Jewish legalists, the Gnostic-like teachers that promoted divisive and ungodly ideas. We get that from Titus. There was moral decay in the church, and the Christians were called to live in stark conditions, contrasting to the deceitful and self-indulgent culture of these Cretans. And there was a lack of structure. Titus was tasked with appointing elders and establishing order and addressing moral and doctrinal issues in this regard. Now, who was Titus? I mean, you can dig up your own details about Titus, but the bottom line is he was a Greek Gentile and a close companion of Paul, likely converted under Paul's ministry. Paul himself says in Titus 1 verse 4, "Mine own son after the common faith." Titus was entrusted with key missions in other epistles that we read from Paul, specifically in Corinthians. But anyway, Titus was helped with resolving issues in the Corinth church. He was also involved in handling of the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. And then, of course, here on the Isle of Crete, Paul left him there in order to put in order the things in the church or the churches at Crete, specifically with regard to choosing elders and leaders and depositing sound doctrine into these churches and getting rid of false doctrines in this regard. And that's really about it. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else that is worthwhile mentioning. Again, all of this content is just a matter of taking it to mind, not even to heart. It's just taking it to mind to understand that, can I just put it this way, to understand that Paul, in this time that he had left, and he knew it was a short period of time, was completely focused on getting the churches strengthened. Not just here at Crete, but all over this journey that he took before he was arrested the second time and then martyred. Paul's focus was to get the churches strengthened and also to pass over the mantle to people like Timothy and Titus and other leaders. It was to leave these churches in capable hands, to strengthen them and keep the churches going. This was Paul's heart and his final need at this point of time. So you could understand Paul's urgency in this regard and to really set things in order to keep these churches from falling apart. And he put a lot of trust in Timothy and Titus and these types of elders to keep things going here at this point. And then, of course, because Paul visited the churches at Crete and left Titus there, he was aware of the state of these churches, and he had no time to spend to get things in order himself, and this is why he left Titus there. Paul was exposed to the deceitful, ungodly doctrines and practices and the state of the church and these types of things. So at the end of the day, he put all that responsibility on Titus to keep things going here, and of course Timothy in Ephesus. This is what we need to take into account when we start to get into Titus now in the next video. I'm going to take it really slow. There's actually, even in the first 4 verses, there is a lot to say because there's certain words that Paul uses that need some deeper insight. And there's certain verses that I'll completely skip over. But the idea behind going through Titus, and I'll wrap up with this, is that Paul addresses this letter to Titus. You and I are not Titus. And even now, in this day and age, we are not particularly, unless you are a pastor or in charge of a church, we are not particularly overseeing a body of believers. So we must understand that the letter of Titus is written specifically to this individual, Titus. And it has to do with church leadership and establishing order and establishing sound doctrine and getting rid of false doctrines and edifying different groupings of people like old men, old women, young women, slaves and masters, and reconfirming godly living and so forth throughout the book of Titus itself. And although he was addressing this to Titus as the leader and one to put the responsibility on of getting this church strengthened and organized, there's a lot that you and I can learn, not from a church leadership point of view, unless you are in that position in itself, as I say, then you can pick up from all of the content of Titus. But if we're not in a leadership position and not overseeing a body of believers, you and I can learn from Titus just from what Paul mentions concerning godliness, concerning order in and structure in our day-to-day living, and what an elder and the elder's characteristics are. What is the characteristics and the observances and the ways of living for old men and old women, young men, young women, masters and slaves? We can fall into any of those categories, and we can look at what Paul defines as godly living in this regard, and learn from the examples that Paul uses in Titus, and learn what is false doctrine versus what is godly and sound doctrine, and various other things, even if we deep dive into specific words and phrases that are relevant in this regard, specifically to you and I who are maybe just laymen, right, in a church context. So anyway, that is what we are going to be doing as we get into Titus now. But I'd like you to remember what Paul has gone through from being urged by the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, to his capture and arrest, and his 2 years spent in Caesarea, to his journey to Rome and his 2 years under house arrest there, to being released and then edifying the churches and strengthening and putting leaders in positions to continue this work even after Paul gets killed in his second Rome imprisonment. So to remember these details and to keep them in the foreground while we read through Titus, to understand Paul's heart, why he encouraged Titus in this regard, why there was a measure of urgency in the book, and why he was depositing all this information to strengthen and establish and keep that church going even after he was gone. This was Paul's heart, and this was Titus's position, even through all that ungodliness and that slothfulness and things that were characterized by the people. So there was such a work to be done. And there's such depth in the book of Titus that you and I can draw from as well, to be encouraged with and edified. All right, so in the next video we will start with Titus, but let's keep this in our minds when we get started. Thanks very much. This was really good information, even from my point of view. I'm quite ready now to get into Titus and start in understanding it in this proper context. So join me in the next video, and we will get into a verse by verse of Titus. Thanks very much.